I'm Nicholas Balsi with JustTheNews.com, here with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for taking some time to join me here. So let me start with asking you about Italy during this coronavirus, because you're there in Rome. From what you've seen of how they're dealing with the virus, anything from your observations that the U.S. Could learn from the way Italy has handled it, and any advice you might have for the administration going forward on that issue?
Well, the Italians were panic stricken because they have about 100,000 Chinese workers in northern Italy. And they kept open the airplanes much later than Trump did. And so they had people flying straight back from Wuhan to northern Italy. And it finally got so bad that they literally closed the whole country down. We were basically locked down for about 10 weeks. Grocery stores, gas stations, pharmacies were the only three things open. If you were in the street without a legitimate reason, they could fine you up to $3,200. And they eventually wore down the virus by just starving it. People were staying away from each other. So about 2 weeks ago, they began reopening restaurants, museums, now movie theaters. So far, it has not bounced back. They've had, I think, 35 new cases yesterday in the entire country. And the number of deaths has gone down, and the number of intensive care units has gone down, number of hospitalizations has gone down. But it took a really dramatic effort over here because it was out of control, sort of in the way that New York City was.
And as we look forward with coronavirus here in the US, I mean, they're talking about a possible second wave. What do you think the administration should do at this time when it comes to the strategy? Because we're seeing a lot of states reopen, but some governors look like they're going to start pulling back in terms of how rapid they thought the reopenings could go. What do you think the administration should do, how to handle this situation at this time in the United
Well,
States?
look, I think you want to reopen carefully. You want to recognize how big a country we are. I mean, New York's a good example. New York City was a disaster, but there were some counties in upstate New York that had almost no virus. So it doesn't make any sense to apply to a series of small towns the same draconian rules that Cuomo was applying in New York City. Wyoming has very few cases, so you wouldn't want to treat Wyoming like Los Angeles. I don't know to what extent the current spike is coming from all the demonstrations and all the people who are getting together in pretty close quarters. We go back and look at some of those demonstrations. It was a total violation of everything we've been told by the public health people, who suddenly turned around and said, "Oh, well, now if you want to demonstrate, that'll be okay." Well, the virus doesn't know why you're standing next to me. So political demonstrations is not a vaccine. I think the administration is working very hard to get to a vaccine. That would be, of course, an enormous breakthrough. I also think they're learning. It's an interesting double standard or double whammy. We now do over 500,000 tests every day. We're discovering a lot of people we didn't know had the disease because they had it so mildly they didn't notice it. Well, should you panic about that, or does that mean that the actual rate of dying is actually smaller than we thought because so many more people have already had the disease? And I'm inclined towards the second interpretation. Eventually, I suspect virtually everyone will have gotten some form of it. Almost nobody under 60 will be hospitalized. Nobody under 25 will even know they have it, except on rare occasions. It'll be like having a mild flu. And eventually we'll begin to build up what they call herd immunity. And at that point, it will simply become a little bit like the way every year we deal with the flu. We know it's coming. We know, we recommend people take a flu shot every year. And they have to make a different one every year because the flu mutates so fast. We don't know yet if COVID-19 is going to have that same mutation characteristic. So you may actually need, once you figure out what the vaccine is, you may actually have to redo it annually to fit however the COVID has evolved. But unlike something like Ebola, which is terrifyingly deadly, I suspect we'll find in the long run that we can live with this if we're rational, and we can find ways. In Italy, They've opened up the restaurants, the museums, the movie theaters. And Calista and I routinely go out and have dinner and don't think anything of it. It's just back to life as usual.
You mentioned the protests. Were you surprised when you saw Pelosi and some governors like Gretchen Whitmer out in the protests actually participating after all this happened with the coronavirus? Were you surprised when you saw that?
No, because I think they're classic politicians and demagogues, and if there's a parade, they want to be in front of it. I think that's what that's all about.
I wanted to ask you, about your book and about Trump looking forward with the election. We've seen the poll numbers dropping for the president, his approval rating, and we've seen some polls with Biden up as high as 14%.
Right.
Do you think that the president needs to change strategy at this point in some way going forward? Needs to shift anything around? What would be your advice to kind of give him a jump start in the campaign and kind of restart the campaign?
Well, first of all, it's a long way to the election, and I campaigned with George H.W. Bush in 1988 when he was 19 points behind in May, and we won by 8 in November. So 1 out of every 4 Americans switched during that period. I think the longer they can keep Biden in the basement, the better off they are. Every time he comes out of the basement, like yesterday in Pennsylvania, he said that 120 million Americans had died from COVID, which is, insane. Last week, he said he was running for the U.S. Senate. I think he has a fairly limited grip on things. And I think the more that they can hide him, the better. It makes perfect sense that they're going to have a virtual convention because it lets them control it with minimum risk. The president has a problem that he's actually governing and not focused as much on messaging as he should be. But I would argue that Trump only has to do 3 things. He has to get the economy growing, period. That is the base without which nothing else works. Second, he has to communicate what a Biden, Schumer, Pelosi world would be like. So people understand it's not just Biden, but it's this entire movement that would radically change America in ways you and I can't imagine. And third, he has to offer a set of positives. For example, maybe a 12-month holiday from the payroll tax to help small business and help Americans have money in their pocket. Maybe 100% indexing so that, or rather 100% deductibility for businesses so that you could really have a dramatic investment. And you could also bring all the manufacturing back from China. Maybe an infrastructure program big enough that our transportation system would be as modern and as efficient as the Chinese. And a number of things he could offer that would be sort of a Trump vision of the future that I think was worth his really looking at. So get the economy growing, define the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer team, offer the American people a vision of what a second term would be like that would have a really exciting feel to it. So people really would want to go out and make it happen.
Do you think it's a strategy to keep Biden in the basement, as you say, and keep him out of the public speaking?
Sure. And if I were them, that's what I would do because, for example, the California legislature just passed a reparations commission to pay blacks money, presumably for slavery, but I think it's worded so that it's everybody. If you're a Jamaican who arrived Tuesday, you get some money. Biden doesn't want to take a position on that. Governor Cuomo said that it was fine to tear down statues because it makes people feel good. Well, I don't know that Biden wants to comment on Cuomo's comment, or the mayor of Seattle who said that taking over 6 blocks of the city would be like a summer of love. They've now had 4 people shot and a woman raped. But, does Biden want to fight with all of these Democrats, or does he just So I think his strategists have figured out, look, as long as Trump is getting beaten up by the news media, and as long as all these problems are on Trump's desk, why reach in and do anything? They could argue with Biden, look, you're winning. Practice your putting game, or play solitaire. Just stay quiet, stay out of it, do as little as possible, and let the world focus on Trump.
And the media has not been able to go to events of his and put him on the spot and ask him anything.
Well, they don't want to.
Up.
Look, 90-something% of the media is a propaganda machine for the left. They don't want to hurt Biden. They are so desperate to beat Trump. They don't want to hurt Biden. So I think their goal would be to say, attaboy, just hang out there and we'll write puff pieces about you.
Do you think it was a mistake for Trump to have that rally in Tulsa, because you've seen some COVID cases on his staff and among the Secret Service? Do you think that's possibly giving off the perception that Biden, by staying away from doing events like that, is careful and he's worried about the public health, whereas Trump is kind of like, let's get back to normal, and it possibly gives off the perception he's a little reckless? What do you think about that?
I think what you said is pretty well said, frankly. I think that the challenge for the president is he believes his reelection, it depends in part on people having a sense of normalcy. So he wants to have baseball come back. He wants to have football in September, and I think he's pushing the margins on the grounds that it may cost him right now, but that it won't cost him in the long run. And I think that it's a real gamble. And I think you put your finger exactly on the challenge for him, because for some people, they prefer safety to risk taking. And it's very clear that Trump is a risk taker, and it's very clear that between the virus and the economy and the Chinese, et cetera, we got a lot of risk out there right now. So it's conceivable that Biden, by hiding, looks passive and looks non-threatening, and that may be reassuring to people. They may say, oh, wow, Biden would never do any of these things. Now, it's also true that Biden probably wouldn't do anything, and Biden would have been a disaster in the first couple of months of the epidemic, because it was Trump's entrepreneurial skill that convinced the American business community to retool and to produce so many masks and so many ventilators that we're now supplying the whole world, because that took a Trump kind of president.
So you think it's a risk for Trump, right? If he
Yes,
pushing...
I think that pushing as hard as he is a risk. On the other hand, I know why he's doing it, and I think he thinks that it's a necessary risk. And the truth is, if you watch him, he is a risk taker. I mean, if we think what will help America for the next 4 years is a passive president while people tear down statues and loot stores and create autonomous zones, Biden will be terrific. But if you think we need somebody very strong because we're in danger from the Chinese, we're in danger from the virus, we have to get the economy growing again, and we have a radical element in America trying to tear down the country, then you need somebody like Trump, even if sometimes he's off-putting. And I think part of the people who elected him did so even though they thought his style was not very good, but because they thought his toughness and his courage were necessary if we were going to turn the country around.
Do you think doing more rallies and possibly having the Republican convention, the traditional convention, will backfire on Trump? I mean, November is a while away, but I mean, what happens today could affect people's perception at swing states.
I think the jury's out. If Trump is right and we can reopen safely with reasonable precautions, he'll probably get reelected. If Trump is wrong, and as a result, states have to shut down again and the economy goes back in the tank, then he probably won't get reelected. no matter what the consequences. Because at that point, people will say, well, that didn't work. So there's a lot riding on getting the next couple of months to work.
And the Democrats seem to already be positioning themselves for that happening, the economy not coming back. They're already, I've been on calls with the DNC chair, they're already saying, we have the worst numbers in history. And they're like kind of alluding to the virus, but not, they're putting it on Trump, that he is the reason why this is going on. His leadership is not bringing us back.
But that's what happens when you're a strong president. I mean, you get you get credit and you get blame. And that's why he needs an objective reality that people are going back to work. I mean, we don't have to go back to the prosperity we had in February. The people have to have the sense that we're working our way out of it, and that with Trump's leadership over the next year, that we'll get back to the kind of unemployment numbers we had in February. If that happens, he probably wins re-election. If it doesn't happen, then I think he's got a huge problem.
So if the economy stays kind of where it is right now and doesn't grow and doesn't really start to bounce back, that's a condition, you think, where he would not win and Biden.
Well, it certainly puts a huge burden on him. Now, on the other hand, when you learn that Biden will consider reparations, which is insane and impossible, when you learn that the Democrats, 207 of them, voted and passed a bill in the House that would give $1,200 to every illegal immigrant as a stimulus package, which most Americans think is crazy. And you go down a whole list. There are enough things where the left is vulnerable that you could imagine this shifting. I mean, Rasmussen just came out and said, by some huge number, Americans favor the police. Americans think you need police, and Americans think that that this whole idea of defunding the police is crazy. So it depends on depending on how the choice is set up. Even with a weak economy, Biden may be in the end be too radical once the campaign focuses on that.
The House has that bill to study reparations and establish a committee,
right,
and they haven't passed it yet, but the CBC chair has mentioned that it's coming down the pike. Do you think they might try to push that through, at least through the House before the election, and set up the reparations message heading into November?
Yeah, they need a rallying cry in the Black community because they can't sell their performance. So you go to a place like Chicago where 102 people were shot this weekend, and you say, yes, but I'm going to get you reparations. You know, every person who's Black deserves $35,000 or whatever the number is. So would you like $35,000? If you do, vote for us. Now, you start getting into questions in the age of Elizabeth Warren, what would your genealogy have to be like? Would you have to be 100% Black? Would you have to actually have great-grandparents who were slaves? Could you be the wealthiest single subgroup in America are Nigerians. So are Nigerians going to be eligible for the reparation? I mean, just think about it. Once you start down this road, basically they are reinstating racism, but this time it'll be Black racism instead of white. But they're reinstating racism because they want to divide the country by race, which was the opposite of old-time liberalism.
Implementing that would definitely be a debate and a challenge, because even if you look at Barack Obama as an example, his mother was white, and I remember reading stories about how if you trace her family history back, they owned slaves.
So think about this. Would Obama be eligible for 50% of the reparation since he's half white? And since his father actually was from Africa and went back to Africa, what are the grounds for Obama getting any money? I mean, how was his father was a free person in an independent country. So but I mean, you raised the right thing, and this is part of why I wrote Trump and the American Future, because I think we're going to face these huge decision points over the next couple of years, and I don't think I don't think we understand yet how bad the left has become, how far. In New York, for example, they have a no bail rule. So they had a bank robber who was arrested 6 consecutive days robbing a bank. They arrest him, take him in, they'd release him because they had no bail. And then they'd rearrest him the next day. And on the 6th day, he finally said to the police, why won't they keep me? Because apparently he actually wanted to go back to prison. He was comfortable in prison and he was safe in prison. And, and they wouldn't keep him because, they don't keep anybody.
Do you foresee a President Biden being able to tame those policies like reparations, or do you think the far left will have a really strong voice in a Biden presidency?
I think Schumer and Pelosi are licking their chops at the idea of having a person as weak as Biden as president because they think they'll be able to bully him into everything they want. And frankly, I haven't seen any evidence of Biden standing up to anybody. So I could imagine it would be a very, very left-wing presidency.
Yeah, because there are things that the far left wanted, like reparations, even when Obama was in office, and he, kind of put the kibosh on that.
And when you look at, for example, Biden has appointed AOC to co-chair his climate committee. Well, the first thing they're going to do, and Biden has said this publicly, is they're going to close down the American oil and gas industry. Now, the economic implications of that, the jobs it'll kill, the tax revenue to state and locality. You go to a place like Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, where natural gas is huge. And it's almost like these people have no clue about the real world. So they make up these policies that don't get you anywhere. But he claims that he's for it. And I think if you had a Pelosi-led House and a Schumer-led Senate, they would get him sometime in the first year a radical anti-energy industry bill.
Like a Green New Deal type bill?
Yeah, basically the Green New Deal. Which if you look at the economic implications, would guarantee that we would stay in a depression for at least a decade.
Is the energy issue, you think, something Trump should be honing in on in the swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan?
Yeah, I think they will. I think they know enough to communicate that, and they have very clear quotes from Biden about closing down the natural gas industry. So I think they'll be able to communicate it. That's why I think when you get to the campaign, a large part of the soft support for Biden goes away. And people start realizing, oh, I didn't know that. That's what happened with Dukakis when he was 19 points up, nobody knew how liberal he was. And every day we would, find a new piece of liberalism and he would lose support. And I think that Biden will be the same way. Once we get to a real campaign and we are really focused, I think that the combination of Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer, that's a lot for the country to bear.
With the Dukakis comparison, though, Biden, he's been in the public eye for so long. Do you think people kind of look at him and say, we know Biden, we know what he's like, we know his record, he was Obama's
Sure.
VP, and that's helping him in a way.
But that's why you have to run a campaign, because you have to be in a position to say, this is what he really stands for. This is who he really is. And then I think he does melt. I think it's very hard for Biden to survive. Once you know what he stands for, I think he gets much weaker pretty fast.
Yeah, and if this continues with the coronavirus, it's just harder for the media to question him and get him on these current issues, like you said, reparations, or with the statues coming down.
But that's the job of the campaign. They can't rely on the news media to do anything that would hurt Biden, because the news media's number one goal is to beat Trump.
And
So I think, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you about the statues because you've mentioned it a couple times. The statue situation, when you hear Trump say we have to protect the American heritage, and do you think that is another message that could hurt him in swing states? Because they're already saying, a lot of Democrats, he's siding with people who are terrible. He's siding with racists. He's siding with white supremacists. It's like, is that message a good one too, to be kind of signaling that you're in favor of the statue staying up?
Remember, the people who are out there now are talking about taking down George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, probably dynamiting Mount Rushmore. You now have a guy out there saying that any statue or painting that shows Jesus as being white should be destroyed. So I think it gets out of hand pretty rapidly, and most people agree that no one should have the right on their own to go and destroy things. I mean, if you want to go through a political process and say, well, that particular statue should be moved into a museum or whatever, that's one thing. But to just go out on your own and say, I have decided I will destroy this, clearly is the end of civilization as we've known it. I mean, these are vandals and barbarians.
So you don't think it'll stop at the Confederate statues? They'll continue on in other areas.
Oh yeah, I think once they get started and they believe they have the right to impose on you what they believe, then I think you don't have, there's no natural automatic stopping point. And you see them, they're talking, for example, about taking down the statue in Washington of Lincoln as the great emancipator, which was paid for by free slaves. I mean, literally, it's a great historical monument, and slaves who had been freed by Lincoln gave money and ultimately raised enough money to build the statue. And yet, idiots who know no history or who hate America want to tear down the statue. And that's the sort of thing you're up against. And, when the Taliban in 2001 blew up two giant Buddhas. One was 120 feet, and the other was 170 feet. The entire world condemned them because these were great religious artifacts that were 2,000 years old. Well, that's sort of how I feel about these guys who are out here destroying things. They have no idea what their value is. They have no idea what the history is. They just want to engage in anarchism in a way which I think no civilized society can tolerate.
Berkeley is renaming their Jefferson and Washington schools, public schools, the elementary schools already. So it is starting to happen where they're focusing on the founders, these activists, and even some Democrats are, doing
Right.
that. Do you think that's next, where the whole foundation of the country and our founders, the only thing they're judged on, like Washington, solely is the slaves owner aspect?
I think if you look at the article written by the woman who did the 1619 Project for the New York Times, she wrote an article in the middle of the 90s that whites are devils, demons, evil. It's an amazing article. It's a totally racist rant. Well, she would take down every statue that was white. It was just, you look at that stuff, you think, these people really do represent an alternative civilization, and they really would destroy ours. I'm not quite sure what they build in its place, but they know they hate us.
McCarthy, GOP leader, he said recently that the Democrats should consider changing the name of their party because all these statues that Pelosi's trying to get removed from the Capitol were Democrats with connections to the Confederacy. And the Democrats stood by Jim Crow, and the Democrats defended segregation laws. He was pointing all that out and said, why don't they just consider changing the name of their party? Do you agree with that analysis from him?
I think it's a great analysis to make a point. The Democratic Party was founded by Jefferson and Madison. So If Jefferson's evil, how can they remain Democrats? You know, it's just the people who defended segregation in the US Senate in the 50s, every single one of them was a Democrat. And that's why this whole thing is crazy. You know, Democrats have controlled Chicago for 89 years, since 1931. So why aren't they responsible when 102 people are shot in Chicago? You know, George Floyd was killed in a city run by Democrats, which is in a county run by Democrats, with a Democratic governor of the state. But they, of course, are innocent because they're pure of heart, and they lean left, and they will enact the true faith. It is truly a wild time.
I wrote a story about the statues, most of them being registered Democrats, and pointed also to the McCarthy comments in a story. And the responses on social media, a lot of them are, well, the party platform shifted. Today's Republicans are like Democrats of those times.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
You just say it's simply not true. You know, I mean, it's a little bit of the problem that Tim Scott had. I mean, he's an African-American senator from South Carolina who happens to be a Republican. And so he can be attacked by the left because he's a Republican. I mean, if he were a liberal Democrat, they would be exalting him. They'd be saying what a wonderful person he is. It's the problem Clarence Thomas faced. You can't be a conservative justice and be black. And so I just think this is part of where we're at. And I think a lot of what they say is unworthy of arguing with. It's better to say it's nonsense. It's just false.
So the Republicans just shouldn't even entertain that debate, or do you think they should get right in there and engage in that debate and try to defend themselves?
I think if they get in there, they should get in there with a level of verbal force that communicates how, you know, when Pelosi says Republicans killed George Floyd, that deserves a response that's extraordinarily intense. And I said in response, as a former Speaker of the House, I think she's crazy. I think she'll say anything, she'll do anything. I think it's beneath the dignity of the Speaker's office. And I'm sure it works well in her far left neighborhood in San Francisco. But it's truly amazingly destructive for the country.
So why do you think more prominent Republicans aren't speaking out on statements like that from Pelosi, even Trump, for example, saying, hey, what you just mentioned, that argument about, you know, this city was run by Democrats, police department, the local.
No, I mean, Trump is the one guy doing it. Look, I think a lot of Republicans are intimidated. They don't know how to deal with the media. They're afraid they'll get beaten up, so they just hide. They hope somehow it'll all get better, but they don't want to be the guy who gets scarred up trying to get it to be better. And it's fascinating to watch. I mean, Reagan knew how to do this. And I think we did pretty well with it during the Contract with America period. And Trump has been as good as anybody I've ever seen. But he is taking on about 93 or 94% of the news media, who I now call a propaganda media, not a news media, because they're so far to the left and they so clearly hate him that there's no possibility that they could cover him as though they were reporters.
Reagan did have a lot of defenses. When people would attack him, he'd defend, but he did it in, many historians have noted, a very eloquent way, and kind of was able to rally people around the message. Do you think that's lacking with Trump's approach? When he speaks, he's not uniting people enough around his argument on policy. And
look, I mean, Reagan's one of the greatest communicators ever to be in the White House. And he was a professional communicator on radio, then in movies, then on television, then the General Electric. So he's almost a unique character in that sense. I think Trump does better when he does major speeches that have been thought through and that carry big messages. And I think when he does that, well, when he sticks to that, his numbers come back up very fast, and people have a sense of real respect because he's behaving like a president. But I think his natural style is to be involved in a brawl, and and to get involved in a fight. And he learned that from dealing with Page 6 in New York in the 1980s, and it's very deep inside it.
Tim Scott said something interesting on the Senate floor when they were debating the police reform bill. He said that after Charlottesville, Trump told him during a White House meeting, he said to Tim Scott, "Tell me how to help the people I've offended." After Charlottesville, this is what Tim Scott says Trump told him. Is that a side of Trump that you think he should bring out? Trump should bring out before November?
Yeah, I think he cares about people, and he cares about the poorest people, the people most left behind, vastly more than he lets on. I think he would do. He did a great speech in I think October of 16 at a black church, outlining the differences. And from his perspective, he's, I think, puzzled because he's done far more for historically black universities and colleges than Obama did. He did far more in terms of black unemployment than any president in history. They have had a series of efforts underway on healthcare, and they have school choice, which I agree with them on this, which in these big cities where the unions have destroyed the schools, would at least give parents the right to try to get a better school for their children. So I think he doesn't know how to package it, and I think he's surprised because the black establishment is always going to attack him because he is threatening the very base of their power. I mean, the last thing they want is an effective, committed Republican in black neighborhoods, helping black people and creating an alternative to the Democrats. And I think that's why they automatically have to attack him, because they're trying to keep their machine together.